century and a half, granting them many more decades than the most advanced technologies of other humans. But if their researchers were correct, the core members had only a decade left to live. Goddesses didn't die. She couldn't die. Not yet. Not ever. The problem with relying on advanced ancient technology was never having more than a partial understanding of the tools it depended upon. The core didn't mind the cost of using the technology, which included the necessary sacrifice of other people. History was replete with the expenditure of the lower order to serve the higher order, but their old artifacts had now failed them and were nothing more than inert museum pieces. For the first time in decades, they felt the shadow of death hanging over them. Even though they had foreseen this issue, they had tried to not worry. The core had been confident they'd find what they needed at each checkpoint in their existence. Based on what their researchers had said, the artifacts recovered from Molino held the greatest promise for further rejuvenation of any discovered in recent years. True immortality had been within their grasp. They wouldn't have to worry about death's shadow creeping up on them. They would slay death and take dominion over his domain, but only for them. Julia curled her hand into a fist and sneered. So close. But now their plans were threatened by upstarts. Insects, really. Men and women of no vision who gave their petty support to the pathetic UTC. They'd delayed the ascension of the core. The destroyed hunter ship had been filled with lost technology. It had still been operational. The core could have harvested it unlike any of the leftover, half-rotted scraps they'd been forced to examine. The ship would have set them ahead centuries and accelerated their final advance into divinity. They could have been freed of their incessant need to seek out replacements for their failing artifacts and technology. They would have had an easier time reverse engineering both structure and function. No, not they. She. Julia needed to remember that. Her ancient allies shared a vision, but it was one she no longer subscribed to. She needed to remove any vestige of implied friendship and focus on her future only. The other members of the core didn't realize how many of the Molino artifacts she now controlled. They might suspect, but they couldn't know they hadn't been lost in the destruction of Sophia's ship near Venus. Julia took a deep breath and settled into her chair, folding her hands in her lap. They must all be thinking what she was thinking. The core was too large and too dominated by factions. The interference in her plans was proof of that, as was hers in Sophia's works. The only way to maintain control over humanity was by decreasing the points of failure and reducing the inherent complexity of politics. This needed to be done in the appropriate way, taking stability into account. Unfortunately for others, the filtering and attrition of leaders were inevitable. She chuckled, thinking about the past. In ancient imperial China, the way of the world had been clear. Subjects obeyed rulers because their rulers were granted the mandate of heaven. The system was superior as long as the rulers possessed both talent and vision. It was hard to argue that quibbling, mewling masses could make better decisions than those with power, intelligence, and education. Rebellions were an expression of the ruler failing his or her subjects. The ancients had understood that. When the empire suffered, a clever and well-prepared ruler could deal with it, whether it was providing strength to protect the land from barbarians or stored food to deal with natural disasters. An ill-prepared ruler made his people suffer, which in turn allowed them to justify rebellion by claiming the natural disasters and barbarians were the result of him or her losing the mandate. The ranks of the insurrectionists would swell, and the empire would be toppled without the fundamental belief in the superiority of imperial rule being questioned. In all dynasties, decline was inevitable. Good rulers would give way to poor rulers with the passing of decades. The mandate would always be lost, and a new dynasty would arise, more responsive to the subjects, if only because of the simplest and basest of desires, self-preservation. Thus, the empire would be strong again. But Julia was different. All members of the core were different. They could achieve something physically impossible before. A perfect and lasting rule.